When in doubt, tell the truth.
Why, you pompous windbag.
HBR Talk with Hannah Wallen. Last week, we discredited the feminist-promoted myth that false criminal allegations are harmless. We talked about the various effects they have, and it's very clear that they do terrible harm to the target, are potentially harmful to everyone around him, and can even be argued to impact society at large. The question that raises is, what does the continued behavior indicate about the people who defend, promote, and engage in it? To answer that, we have to consider a standard feminists fought to get society to adopt: anti-harassment law and policies regarding the workplace. These differ depending on which meaning is used in them. Criminal harassment varies in standards, as Fine Law points out, depending on where the complaint takes place. Civil standards on harassment, which involve behavior over which the alleged target sues the alleged perpetrator, have a different set of parameters and criteria than criminal harassment. The dictionary definition, which is looser than either of those and varies from publisher to publisher, isn't an authoritative statement on law, but gets used in policies at various institutions anyway. U.S. Legal points out that criminal harassment, which has the strictest criteria, is generally defined as a course of conduct which annoys, threatens, intimidates, alarms, or puts a person in fear of their safety. It goes on to say that harassment is unwanted, unwelcomed, and uninvited behavior that demeans, threatens, or offends the victim and results in a hostile environment for the victim. Local statutes may vary in some detail, but they all generally follow that set of criteria. Civil standards are looser, and feminists are working to expand them even further. The New York University Review of Law and Social Change hosts a paper by Wendy N. Hess, Associate Professor, University of South Dakota School of Law, which argues that sexual rumors in the workplace impose a double standard and constitute gender-based insults, and therefore are a form of sexual harassment, specifically when women are the subject of them. The paper's conclusion is that this should be fodder for sexual harassment lawsuits, but again, only when the complainant is a woman. In criminal and civil terms, harassment generally involves an individual's pattern of behavior over time. But victim identitarians, the group that has had the most influence over standards governing institutional handling of harassment complaints, have attempted to expand the definition to include patterns of separate one-time actions committed by different individuals who are part of a group. If the actions would constitute harassment, should they all be one person's course of conduct over time? In other words, their argument is that if the target feels harassed, the pattern constitutes harassment. That is how victim identitarians get away with leveling harassment allegations at whole demographics like the men's rights movement, Gamergate supporters, male participants in just about any hobby you can name, sports fans, religious groups, political parties, and anyone else they want to defame or control. According to their standards, a pattern of behavior doesn't need to all be committed by the same person to constitute harassment. The law disagrees with them, but putting that aside for a moment, what does that make it when a bunch of women all gang up to level demonstrably false or increasingly flimsy public allegations of intimate partner and sexual violence against the same guy or the same group? By legal standards, it's nothing if there's no evidence of a conspiracy among the accusers, but if victim identitarians were held to victim identitarian standards, they'd have to consider the behavior a harassment campaign, regardless of whether it was organized or coincidental. As we established last week, the experience of facing a false criminal allegation is horrible. At the very least, being lied about is offensive and annoying, and the type of lie involved represents a threat of social consequence even when stated unofficially rather than as a complaint to police. From there, it gets worse. The target could face vigilante action, including violence. If the lie is told to police, the target will face arrest, an investigation, and the impact increases from there. In extreme cases, false allegations have proved to be deadly, so certainly it is reasonable to say that falsely accusing someone of a heinous crime fits or can fit any or all of the criteria for harassment. It is unwanted, unwelcomed, and uninvited behavior, demeans, threatens, or offends the victim, results in a hostile environment for the victim, and annoys, threatens, intimidates, alarms, or puts the victim in fear of their safety. If, as victim identitarians insist, we remove the requirement that behavior be one person's course of conduct to be considered harassment, and we consider sexual rumors harassment as Professor Hess desires, then a group targeting the same individual with allegations without evidence fits the definition. Despite this, the behavior is socially accepted among victim identitarians, with increasingly ridiculous examples presented in public without question. The latest assertion regarding Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh illustrates this, as John McCormick explains in his National Review article, "The New York Times anti-Kavanaugh bombshell is actually a dud." In the story's second paragraph, McCormick writes, "The allegation Robin Pogrebin and Kate Kelly write in a New York Times story adapted from their forthcoming anti-Kavanaugh book is this: We also uncovered a previously unreported story about Mr. Kavanaugh in his freshman year that echoes Ms. Ramirez's allegation." The article notes later that Ms. Ramirez is the woman who claimed to have possibly come into accidental contact with Justice Kavanaugh's exposed genitals at a party. The paragraph continues with more of the quote. "A classmate, Max Steyer, saw Mr. Kavanaugh with his pants down at a drunken dorm party where friends pushed his penis into the hand of a female student." As if the ridiculousness of the details of the so-called bombshell weren't discrediting enough, McCormick goes on to point out, quote, "The book notes quietly that the woman Max Steyer named as having been supposedly victimized by Kavanaugh and his friends denies any memory of the alleged event." This is followed by a scathing criticism of the lack of journalistic integrity at the New York Times. Omitting this fact from the New York Times story, he writes, is one of the worst cases of journalistic malpractice in recent memory. He's right. That's a reprehensible level of journalistic fraud. But is that all it is? This is just the latest in a string of rapidly deteriorating, quote, bombshells dropped on Justice Kavanaugh in an attempt to prevent or undo his appointment to the Supreme Court, a factor his accusers admitted was their reason for, quote, coming forward with their allegations. In other words, without evidence and without even ensuring that their stories were credible sounding, a gang of women, political rivals, political commentators, and media outlets targeted a man with unfounded, largely unfalsifiable defamatory sexual rumors intended to derail his career. If he'd been a female desk jockey in some Midwestern cubicle maze, feminist academics like Professor Hess would see that as justifiable fodder for a workplace sexual harassment lawsuit. Instead, the fact that it didn't work was treated by feminist and progressive media as evidence that our society is a misogynistic rape culture. Imagine being so entitled as to consider the same behavior reprehensible when it's done to you, but a special right when you do it. Imagine being so accustomed to your community accommodating your sense of entitlement to that double standard that you'd view refusal to do so as a targeted attack on you based on who you are. Sounds kind of privileged, doesn't it?